Hello everyone, I am Taureor and this is my review of Torment, Tides of Numenera, a new textwall RPG, well, not so new anymore, from InXile Entertainment. It's the same guys that brought us Wasteland too. The title itself tells us that it is a callback to one of the greatest role-playing games of all time, Planescape Torment. The game does have a similar style, similar theme. It was supposed to be the spiritual successor to Planescape Torment. Did it succeed? Well, let's see. The game is set in the world and system of Numenera. It is an interesting blend of fantasy and science fiction. It happens in a very, very distant future after several civilizations have risen and fallen, and the technologies from previous civilizations are so sophisticated that they are basically magic. If you try to be super analytical about it, it would be science fiction, but a genetically engineered dragon is still a dragon and it does have a feel of fantasy. That's why I'm saying it is a blend. And it's a pretty good one. The most important thing in a game like this, at least for me, is the writing. So let's talk about it. The world and the characters are very deep and detailed. And when I say it's a textual RPG, I'm not exaggerating. You spend most of the game talking to people and reading stuff. And it's a good thing. It actually feels almost more like an interactive novel than a game, thanks to that. I will try to avoid major spoilers, but there are parts of the game which are literally interactive novels. You can find artifacts known as Merecasters, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Anyway, they let you access other people's memories, and those parts are literally interactive novels. Still, even though the world and the characters are very deep, detailed, and well written, there is some fault. I suppose the simplest way for me to put this is that the world is a collection of deep, interesting characters and stories that don't interconnect so very well. Of course, there are connections, and there are good and meaningful ones, but the world doesn't really feel as a whole, as all the parts belong there. I think the closest comparison would be a part of Pillars of Eternity that I didn't really like. If you recall, Pillars of Eternity had a Kickstarter campaign that let some of the backers put a bit of their own story into the game, and it was accomplished in a way that you met a random character, just a bystander somewhere, and you could see stuff about them. I'm not going to get into details. Anyway, those were side stories, if you will, and they did tend to take me out of the game in Pillars of Eternity. Torment did give me such a feeling on several occasions. And I think I would fault it to the pacing of the story. Theoretically in Torment you are supposed to hurry because a big scary monster is after you. However, the player doesn't really feel this sense of urgency. The game consists of main story bits which are amazing, interrupted by sequences of relative freedom and sandbox style exploration of the world. Well, maybe not really sandbox style, but you know what I mean. And even though each of the parts is good individually, I feel like the exploration parts slow the game down too much and they take you out of the main story. And it's difficult for me to judge if this is a good or a bad thing, because on the one hand, you do like to complete all the side stories if you have a chance to do so. But then again, if you are given all the time you need, it sort of makes all the urgency that the game is trying to imply feel artificial. If I were to try and summarize my point here is that all the individual parts of the game's story, both the main story and all the side quests, side missions, side stories and so on, are very good, but I object to how they're put together a little bit. This results in the pacing of the game being a little off, because at some points it just becomes a walk around the area and talk to everyone type of game. But again, only parts of the game suffer from this. While we're on the subject of writing and story, I must say that some of it was a little bit anticlimactic. If you played through it, you know what I'm talking about. If you didn't, I won't spoil it. Still, my overall opinion of the writing is positive. We'll touch upon the subject a little bit when we're discussing the graphics and sound later on. But now let's move on from writing to graphics. I'd say that the look of the characters and effects, combat moves and so on is nothing really special, but the locations are extraordinary. The start of the game and the labyrinth had me mesmerized the first time I saw them. Also, I'm still very, very impressed with the bloom, which is a huge living organism with people living inside of it, and it periodically eats some of them. It's the stuff of nightmares. Also, the illustrations that are the background of the interactive novel parts that I mentioned earlier are extraordinarily well done, and they convey the feeling of what you're supposed to be experiencing. So that is a huge plus for me. Now onto the sound design. I have quite mixed feelings here, because some parts are amazing and some parts are not. There is too little voice acting, too little narration and too little voice acting, in my opinion. I realize this might be due to budgetary constraints. However, the voice acting that is present in the game is very high quality, and more of it would significantly improve the immersion in the story. For example, the opening bit with the narrator is just great, but there is very little of that. Also, the music and the ambient sounds don't always play well together. What I mean is, the music is a deep and dark tune often, and sometimes it does clash with the ambient sounds, which can be just noise. Each of those aspects is okay individually, but I just don't think they are combined together perfectly. I found that I had to almost completely mute sound effects to enjoy the game, because in some locations they just became noise, which might be justified and realistic in some cases, but it can also damage your enjoyment of the game. Now let's move on to the game mechanics and the gameplay itself. I would say that character development is rather limited, but this is not really a problem in this type of game, because Torment has very little combat. And interestingly, you have three main statistics, might, speed and intellect, I think, pools of stats, and you can use them in combat and in conversations and other actions, which is an interesting idea. For example, you can pump all your intelligence into a magical attack that will decimate your enemies, but you'll be too tired to solve a puzzle that requires intelligence later on, and that will force you to find a place to rest, which is usually quite expensive. This system also has some minor flaws. For example, you can pump intelligence or might or speed points into tasks to ensure your success. If you're capable enough and if you spend enough points, you can ensure a 100% success rate. And I believe it takes a little bit of the excitement away. I prefer the system the old Fallout games introduced, where in combat, no matter how skilled you were, you could never have more than 95% chance of success. In Torment, combat isn't really combat. It's a crisis, and most of them can be resolved in multiple ways. For example, you can use environment objects, interact with them to achieve various results, or you can even talk to your enemies, sometimes convince them to change sides or surrender to you. And that is quite a neat approach. Most combat can be avoided, but I would say that it lacks balancing, at least a little bit. I found the game to be extremely easy most of the time, apart from some sequences. One in particular, but I can't really talk about it without spoiling a lot of the story, but I'll give you some vague idea about it. That particular sequence I'm talking about combined the urgency of having to do some stuff in a short time with the danger of permanently losing your companions if you allow them to die. And that was very exhilarating. Unfortunately, there isn't much content like this. If you develop your character right and don't make any major mistakes, most of the game is actually very easy, and so is most of the combat. Also, I appreciate the ability to avoid most combat. However, I also felt that it was achieved too easily at some points. As for the game and combat mechanics, they're pretty basic. Your characters have initiative, they have their movement and their action. Most attacks use action, some use movement. Nothing especially interesting about that. One thing that warrants attention is actually the main feature of this game system of Numenera. It's the ciphers. Ciphers are one-use-only artifacts from ancient civilizations. You find a lot of them in the world, and the interesting thing is you cannot have too many at once, because they interact with each other and cause sickness. So you can only carry a limited amount, which prompts you to actually use them, rather than hoard them, like potions in most of the games. I think most of us are guilty of saving all the fun stuff for when it's needed later, and then actually not using it at all. The cipher system actually fixes that in a lot of ways. While we're on that subject, I'd also like to say that the economy of the game is not balanced well. Basically, for the first part of the game, you're broke always, you have money for nothing, and then from about half of the game, you're so loaded that you can buy anything you want. At least that was my experience. Alright, let's try to summarize and draw some conclusions. I believe it's a wonderful thing that this game came out and that it is as popular as it is. We need more story-focused deep RPGs. On the other hand, it does have some obvious shortcomings, so if I were to rate it, to give it a number, I have a really hard time finding a solution. So I'll try to take you through my reasoning, and then you'll see if you can agree with me. If I were to only assess the story of the game, treat it as an interactive novel, I would rate it very highly, 9, maybe 9.5 out of 10. Not a full 10 because of some underwhelming bits and the connections between elements of the story not always being well done, but still a very high number. Many parts of the story are just amazing, and so are the locations. A few days ago, when walking down the street, I saw a crack in the sidewalk and I flinched because for a split second I thought that was one of the mouths of the bloom waiting to devour me. And even though it was only a split second, it does show how much of an effect the story had on my imagination. But we also have to treat it as a game, rate its gameplay, rate its mechanics, and for those and the pacing, I would probably give a 7. When we combine all of this, both the story and the gameplay, I believe a fair verdict would be an 8.5 out of 10, which in my rating system means that it is a very good game that you should certainly play if you are into RPGs, and especially story-heavy textual RPGs. So yes, this game has my sincere recommendation. And that's about it. If you haven't tried it already, and you are into that sort of game, make sure to check it out. I'm sure some of you will disagree with my assessment, and I do encourage a discussion. I will try to address as much of it as I can. Just remember that reviews are opinions, and this was mine. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.